Hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. I'm Emma, and I'm here today with the incredible Kelly.
Hello.
And the wonderful Kellyanne.
Hello.
And we are also joined today by a very special guest, one Mr. Tim Whitaker of the New Evangelicals, founder, creator, genius,
wise sage.
Wizard of deconstruction,
Wizard of deconstruction. Wow, that is a title. He is the voice behind the New Evangelicals Instagram and podcast and TikTok. And online community in general. So thank you so much for being here today, Tim. We are so stoked to talk with you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
And with all that being said, I didn't talk about what we're going to talk about, but we'll talk about it as we dive in to this episode with Tim. Let's do it. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
Without expectation or judgment,
we will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
First, for anybody who doesn't know, Tim Whitaker has created the New Evangelicals. He's going to tell you more about what it is than we are, but they are talking about exploring different ways to do Christianity. They're talking about more progressive Christianity. They're clapping back at Christian nationalism. They're doing all sorts of amazing content and building community around it. So, Tim, just to start us off, what does the New Evangelicals even mean? Tell us.
Yes, well, as the wizard of deconstruction, as you so aptly put it, I mean, ultimately, the bottom line is this, right? I mean, the word evangelical means someone who brings good news. I don't think evangelicals today, broadly speaking, bring a lot of good news. So the idea is hopefully we can bring some good news back. And that's kind of the idea behind the New Evangelicals. Some people are like, ooh, the word evangelical is super triggering. I totally get that. I'm not asking people to sign on to identify as a new evangelical. I just think that
you don't have a membership process where they
it's
have
like
to
a denomination
sign
split.
off to
You don't have like a 6-week course.
I was going to get there. Essentially, you have to tithe 10% of your income to me, and
so
we're
it counts.
not transparent with finances.
Pray in the direction of New Jersey every time that you pray.
Exactly, yes. And call me, I can only be addressed as Mr. Wizard. That's the only way you can talk to me.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of the idea is, I'm kind of stubborn and I didn't want to give up the name evangelical to fundamentalists. So I just called it the New Evangelicals, started the account on Instagram, and 2 years later, we're a nonprofit and I'm doing this work full time, and it kind of exploded, which is just wild. And we're just doing our best to push things forward.
Yeah.
Honestly, and wow, there's so much good content for you to make. One, from like a Christian perspective, but also just what's happening in the world and the church's constant response. Like you have like an endless keeping up with the Kardashians every day.
Well, and it's been fun for us because we've been with you, well, Emma especially from the beginning, like before you really launched and like went full time and did the whole thing.
I remember when it happened. Like when you went full time.
So it's been fun to like watch that journey and be a part of that. It feels like from afar, and now we're finally here and we're chatting and we're about to have a great little conversation. So that's fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredible to see how much the New Evangelicals grew like overnight, it seems like almost. And the way that you've like built community around it, I think is really cool. I even like found my church through New Evangelicals, which is like incredible. And so finding like-minded believers is like that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So it's very cool. But could you give us just a little backstory, like how New Evangelicals came to be and like what you all have been up to?
Just for brief context, I'm an evangelical church kid through and through. I was raised in it. I was literally baptized in it. I was homeschooled for 9 years. I mean, the whole nine. Always really committed to Jesus as much as I knew how to be. Grew up very like conservative fundamentalist, and then started playing drums in more charismatic spaces. So, this is my world. This is what I know. This, these are the circles I've been in my entire life. And I was one of those like typical poster kids, I mean, I did everything right, so to speak. I attended the rallies. I got saved early. I never like wavered from my faith. I was a good kid in high school. My wife and I waited to have sex until we were married. Like we just did everything the right way. And in 2016, and I'm kind of fast forwarding through a lot, but 2016 was really the year where I thought something is really wrong in my faith tradition with this Donald Trump situation. And the key, like the main point that sticks out to me that I tell people is that it was very jarring watching people that raised me, who I kept in touch with on Facebook, who were mad at me, who raised me in purity culture, this idea that you can't touch yourself or anyone else until you're married, then tell me that I'm crazy and ungodly for not voting for the guy on the cover of Playboy magazine, the guy who's cheating on his wife with the porn star, the guy who's bragging about sexually assaulting women on a hot mic, the guy who is making lewd comments about his daughter if she wasn't his daughter. And I'm like, wait, you're mad at me because I can't vote for that because you taught me that like integrity matters and that, better is a good name than gold or silver. I mean, these are like verses that you drilled into my head. And it was just really weird to see my faith tradition and so many of like its top leaders just really do a full 180 and say, no, Trump is God's chosen candidate. This is who God wants to use to save America. So from that, and then you have the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery. And you have Breonna Taylor and you have George Floyd. And I'm watching the Black Lives Matter movement really take off. And I'm watching pastors that I know sharing like Candace Owens talking points, like really disparaging the movement. I'm like, that's weird. And that was also one of the first moments where I thought, something is really wrong racially in the country. Now, again, I'm a white dude. So my privilege is immense. And I never had to deal with like, or be afraid of getting pulled over by the cops. I didn't know what that was like. And so all of a sudden, like things are just like, I don't have language for it yet, but something is just off about these waters that I'm swimming in. And then when COVID happened, that was kind of the final push for me that made me say, we need a new evangelical movement. And the moment I tell people is, it had to be like early on in the pandemic. We were still wiping down surfaces because we weren't sure how COVID spread yet. And I'm firmly seated in an evangelical church. I'm a drummer. I'm playing worship music all the time. It's my identity. I loved doing it. I was a total nerd for it. We built some really cool like professional level systems at my church. I was all in. And I'm watching this worship leader, this guy named Sean Foyt, who is a guy from Bethel, and he's this worship guy. And he's like, hey, we have to protest these mask mandates because that's what good Christians do. So let's do these big worship gatherings with no masks. We'll call it tyranny and that we're going to resist tyranny. And I remember thinking, and again, at this point, I'm like pretty much a moderate evangelical. Like I'm not crazy far right, but I'm definitely not progressive. I'm thinking, it shouldn't be controversial to wear a mask during a pandemic. Like this doesn't seem like it's a big deal at all. I don't know how it's tyranny. I don't know how it's not loving your neighbor. In fact, I would say not loving your neighbor is not wearing a mask during a pandemic and calling it godly. And that was the moment where I really said to myself, we need a new evangelical movement. And that's where I thought of the name New Evangelicals. I'm like, Tim, you get a lot of like shitty ideas. That idea is not too bad though. You should see if it's taken or not, like if the name's taken, and no one had it. It wasn't anywhere. So I just grabbed them really quick for really a rainy day. And then in December of 2020, I launched the account on Instagram, and that's when everything kind of exploded.
Wow, that's really, I think your journey mirrors so many people's journeys, mirrors my own. I think prior to 2016, I had started deconstructing like purity culture and certain things, and how that had affected me as an adult woman who's married and navigating sex and modesty and still being embarrassed to wear a swimsuit in front of people and like things like that. But really 2016 and leading into especially the 2020 election, a lot of things started to fall apart for me. In addition to other kind of horrible experiences I had had in the church. It sounds like you had such a great experience, which is amazing. I wish I had had that. In that process, another thing I really have discovered, in the overall process, I've really discovered how patriarchal the evangelical movement is. And as you've been unraveling evangelicalism and maybe even reforming it, how do you remove patriarchy from it?
Well, I mean, I think that American evangelicalism has patriarchy kind of built into it. Like, really, in any space, even spaces that would say that we're egalitarian, most of those churches are still run by men. I mean, listen, there are definitely some churches that are women led, but like they're not nearly even close to even like a representative majority or minority of the population. And I think that, at least for me, it took time to realize the power dynamics that were at play. You know, as a man, you don't grow up thinking about it that way. You just think like, oh, this is just what's normal. Like, men are naturally more leader-esque than women. Men naturally have a brain designed for leadership compared to women. You just kind of buy into so many of these like tropes and stereotypes. And then if you grow up like me, which is in more conservative reform spaces, you have a couple clobber verses that you use to kind of prove your point that, you know, women are to be silent, which again, even then they don't really interpret literally. They just mean they can't teach from a pulpit, not that they can't actually say anything during church service. And then you kind of believe this idea of like, well, you know, we're equal but different, which really is, well, we're actually not equal because you have to follow my lead at all times. So that's how we're different. So you get to follow, I get to lead. Isn't that great? And I think that with like the Church 2 movement, and being in this space where, listen, most of our audience, 70% of them are women. Like on Instagram, like the majority are women. So when you start asking questions like, hey, what was your experience in church? What was your experience with purity culture? And you're getting just so many women sharing stories that are so unique, yet have this similar ingredients, you start realizing like, actually, I think this whole patriarchy thing was actually weaponized to keep women under the thumb of men who were actually, many of them, not all, but many were abusive. And then these churches protect those abusive men and they disparage the women whenever they come forward with their stories. And so I think like over time, I just realized like, this system is built to protect men, like primarily. And then again, when you look at 2016 and Donald Trump, I mean, is that not like a slam dunk, like case in point of these white evangelical men being like, hey, I know he bragged about grabbing women, but hey, we need a commander-in-chief, not a pastor-in-chief. It's like, even by your own patriarchal standards, how are you protecting women? Right? Like if your whole point is, oh, well, us men, good men protect women, but you're voting for the guy who brags about sexually assaulting them, I don't know how you call that protecting women. Right. So even their own standard falls apart. So I think that like moving things forward is a realization that like men and women all over the spectrum have all different kinds of abilities. I know plenty of men who are shitty leaders. And I know plenty of women who are great leaders. You know, it's not a gender binary of who's a good leader or not. That is not the main factor here. Or people who have, I mean, I'll just spitball with you. Like on our board, it's all women. I'm the only guy on our nonprofit board. It wasn't intentionally designed that way. It just kind of worked out that way. And they're brilliant. Like I'm not a voting member of the board. I'm accountable to them. They are freaking brilliant. I could not do the work that we do as an organization without them. But if I was still in like that patriarchal system, I'd be like, well, you know, I mean, the woman was deceived first. Am I right? Yeah, it's like it doesn't add, but that's what you hear. And like that shifts how you treat fellow image bearers who are actually quite freaking brilliant at what they can do, but your own bias disparages them. So I think it's a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because one thing that actually somebody else that I know that you love, the Bible Project. So that's Tim Mackey. One thing that he'll talk about a lot is that the Bible is patriarchal. Like they're in a patriarchy. That is the system that they're under in the Bible. Like that is like it just is. It is a male-dominated and led society that the Israelites are living in. And I think recognizing that reality doesn't discredit all of the Bible, but it changes how you look at it, and it changes the lens that you're looking at it through, and trying to apply it to a society that is hopefully trying to be less patriarchal. Although those have been the dominant systems for millennia at this point.
Well, and you mentioned too, your like most of your audience being women, and coming out with stories of their experience in the church. And it's probably the opposite is true for me in the sense that the more I hear about men's former experience in the church who have deconstructed, the more I'm like, where was I? It's very tempting to be like, what was wrong with me? Because it sounds like they had a great time.
Yeah.
And then because of, I think, a true moral compass decided, hey, this isn't right. Like, hating on, like, supporting Brett Kavanaugh instead of the woman who came forward to, like, claim her assault is not the way forward. Like, that's not the Christian thing to do. Anyways, it seems like so many women are almost forced out of the church environment due to, like,
they're just blocked over
and over again. But then I hear stories of men who just, like, have a great experience in the church and love it and have fond memories of it, but then eventually moved on. And it's really interesting how I'm not saying that's across the board, but the dichotomy definitely exists.
Easy when you're in a system that's designed for you.
Yeah. I also think it can be harder because it's harder to see the water you're swimming in, right?
Yes.
Like, if you're fully in it, then... And if you're benefiting, why leave?
That was me. I wasn't like, first off, I can safely say I wasn't misogynistic at all, at least, intentionally. But, like, I definitely lived in church circles that prioritized and valued the leadership of men and prioritized and valued the submission of women, right? Like, a good wife submits, a good wife supports. And that kind of translated over into these church structures too. And so it's like, I wasn't trying. I didn't even realize it, right? Like, you just don't see it because that's all you know. But looking back, I'm like, wow, like I even in these more quote unquote egalitarian spaces, they were still completely led and controlled by men. And if men allowed women to lead, they'd be allowed to lead, but they were still the gatekeepers to church leadership.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it, I think. Even my experience with Bethel, the reason I was drawn to Bethel was the strong, powerful women in their leadership. And it wasn't really until attending and, like, being a part of the environment that I realized, there's a few women up there that are championed and, like, put on stage and who lead, but it's like the internal structure is actually not egalitarian at all.
Yeah.
I just want to call to attention all the things you just said, which I know you're just like, it's whatever. It just worked out this way. But your board is all women. You are the founder and you are a non-voting member of your own board, which is incredibly unique. Like, you don't hear about that a lot. And then you're just like, I'm responsible and like I report to them. Like, all those things are so unique that you just said, and you're really, like, forming a different way of leading, which I think is incredible. Like, all those things that you said, I'm like, that feels just like a nice, like, warm hug to my heart. After dealing with a lot of men that think they know a lot of things and, it doesn't matter what you know. But considering all those things, I have to ask the question on the Woman Being podcast, would you consider yourself a feminist, wise, sage, wizard of deconstruction?
I mean, how do you define feminist? Yeah, I think so.
It depends on the feminist, but I would consider the definition of feminism is the strive for equality and equity for all, but obviously feminism
across, like, gender and sex.
Across gender, sex, but also feminism obviously originally started with women's rights. So that tends to be the thing it's associated with.
I would say absolutely. I have learned, and I'm sure maybe you three have thought about this too. Like you don't give yourself those titles. You don't call yourself an ally. The queer community calls you an ally. You don't get, late. You don't call yourself like, I have a black friend. You don't do that. Like that's not what you do. Your friends who are in those circles give you that title when they feel safe around you. So I feel like that's the same thing for a feminist. Like, I would never identify like I'm a staunch feminist. That's a title that women should give you just because you're doing like the bare minimum of, I don't know, supporting the equality and equity of women. Like these things to me do not seem to be that radical, but for some reason they come across that way. Like even your compliment about me not being a voting member of my board. Well, in nonprofit world, that's pretty standard. Like the director should not be a voting member for the sake of accountability. In church world, that's not super standard, you know? So it's like, I'm glad that stuck out to you. It's a shame that does stick out to you because like accountability should be kind of just baked into the pie. But unfortunately, we've experienced churches that are nonprofits that are led and dictated by like their founding pastor who like controls everything. And so we've just experienced such a toxic version of all this shit that when someone, and I'm not the only one, plenty of people do this, you know, say, yeah, I support equity for women, or I have accountability in my board. Some people are like, oh, wow, you're really breaking the mold. It's like, thank you, but it shouldn't have to be that way.
I completely agree with you. Like 100% agree with you. It's also though, like the man in the workplace that sexually harasses women when they have a non-tolerance policy and he just gets a slap on the wrist and some coaching and he continues to lead, right? Yeah. Like, it's like we all say these things are standard, but in practice, like these things don't happen. The accountability doesn't happen. It's like the desire and need for power is too great. And I think that's what I have seen in my work and church experience. And it's like, wow, sitting here talking with a super cool, super humble white dude that founded this really cool thing. And he's like, nah, like I need that accountability. Like that's what I'm saying is unique.
Yeah. You know, that's really kind. I mean, I do think that, I guess one of the reassuring things is that this is like the human struggle. There's a reason why Lord of the Rings like rings true today, right? Because like this idea of power and especially, I mean, I think all people in some degree want power, but like men tend to be the ones who get it the most because of just like what they're able, because I think of just certain dynamics. And it's like, that's a real thing, like power, the temptation for power and the temptation to rule and the temptation to like, just dictate is a very real thing, I think, for a lot of people who have the personality that I had, that like type A, go-getter, just hardworking, is a visionary kind of vibe. And it can just eat you from the inside out. Like for example, if you listen to that Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast with Mark Driscoll, in the beginning, the clips from Mark are like humble. He doesn't want to become this monster. And then he became the monster that he swore he'd never become. And I think I think part of that is that these evangelical systems for megachurch pastors like do a number on them too. I don't think Brian Houston from Hillsong planned on ending up where he is today when he first started the small church decades ago. But like when you have that kind of power and prestige and everyone's kissing your ass and you have no accountability and you have all this money, like it changes who you are. So I think that like if anyone wants to run a nonprofit in this space, you better damn well put the safeguards in now. Like the board has a terminate button. They have a massive red alert button that they can pull whenever they need to because no one's above it. Like I'm not above becoming Mark Driscoll. We're all capable of doing shitty things, but I think it's that awareness that keeps you hopefully from never becoming that person. That's kind of how I see it anyway.
Right, for sure. And I think that's something that even in my own self that I think about a lot of like, I am an ambitious person. I aspire to own businesses. I aspire to and right? All the things. And like, literally these two ladies, my husband, I'm like, listen, call me out on my shit because I can be a little shit. And like, if no one holds you accountable, if no one's like, hey, you're really fucking up, like you're going to get away with it and it's going to change the inside of who you are, right? Your moral fiber, what your moral compass is. And I'm like, ew, I don't want that. Like even like being a woman in the workplace and hoping to climb the corporate ladder, it's like, I actually don't want to become the woman that steps on other women to get to the room. Yeah. Like, that's actually not what I'm trying to do. And like, without that accountability, like you said. Anyway, all you said is very good. But I have another question. And considering that you are feminist supporting Is that how we should say it?
we could debut a feminist now.
Yeah,
this could be the official.
Yeah, we'll get our sword
we can
out.
do the feminist
we'll do it on
ring.
either shoulder.
You have been given the
Sage
title
wizard.
Thank you.
I'm really loving the theme of this podcast. It's just nerd central, and I'm here for it.
Wow.
But like, what does it look like to operate as a Christian, white, straight, cis, male, aka bro, passing Theo bro passing, feminist? Like, what does that look like? How do you practically implement that in your day to day? I mean, I know you said you have an all women board and all those things, but beyond that, how do you actually practice what you preach, I guess?
It's hard to like give like, oh, well, today this happened. That never proves that I'm this person.
Today I helped a feminist across the street.
Yeah.
So
today I said, go girl.
Right. I call that Mark Driscoll. I don't know. I think that like on a personal level, something that my dad really emulated to me as a kid is that he was always consistent at church and at home. Like I know a lot of people have two different versions of parents, like the public version and the private version. I didn't have that. My dad was always really consistent and his integrity was always like top notch. I mean, my dad's very conservative and he would be like, I hate paying taxes, but we're not going to lie on our taxes because we have to give the government whatever they owe. Like to the point where sometimes like people, when you sell a vehicle, they'll write 0 on like the title. So that way the person doesn't have to pay tax. My dad's like, listen, write whatever you want, but I'm not doing that. Like you have to do that. Like, that's just who he is, And so I think like for me, one of my values is just being the same person on camera and off camera, like being the same person I am with my kids that I am to people that I interact with online. And I think, and this is not just me, this is more an organization on an organizational level, but we have a policy of non-dehumanization, like wherever possible. And so I think that's another big part of like what I keep as a core value to myself. I feel like once you start dehumanizing people, it puts you on the same path as them, and that will inevitably lead to violence. And so I think like those elements of just integrity and trying to be consistent on and off, the Instagram, social media world, and then not dehumanizing even people that I really, really, really don't like, I think are just two ways that hopefully I'm trying to live out like whatever we talk about as ethics I think Christians should strive for.
Yeah, that's really good. I've been, for a fun activity, casually on the side, consuming a lot of anti-feminist content just to see like what is actually the narrative that people believe. Like, so I don't know if you know who Pearl is, but what a woman. Like, just wild. And I mean, she's out here saying, if you don't submit to your man, if you have had sex before, if you gain weight, you're a bad wife. Like all these like really horrible things, really putting down women. And I'm like, it's been a mental exercise for me ever since our last discovery call with you about like, how would I actually respond to this person without dehumanizing them and being very intellectual about it? And and I think it's been an interesting like internal conversation of like, how would I address this without feeding my emotion of frustration and anger to dehumanize them? And it's truly changing the way I disagree with people. And it's really interesting. So I would challenge everyone listening to just, think about, do you dehumanize people? Why or why not? And also, how do you not? How to not?
Yeah. It can be really difficult because it is tempting, especially if you feel like they're dehumanizing you.
Yes.
to then respond without that like retaliation or without feeling like you get licensed to dehumanize them because they've done that to you or to people that you care about or have empathy for.
Yeah.
It can be very easy to feel angry, to feel upset when you've recognized the harm in the theology that you once believed and the people that still purport it, or the harm in just like the systems that we live in. Like you start to just see all of these cracks that you didn't see before.
Especially when it's like the people that raised you to be kind and that raised you to have compassion and that raised you to like, walk a mile with another person, or walk with them 2 miles if they ask you to walk a mile, and give them your coat and offer them, feed those who are hungry, and, put your life down for others. It's very, very hard to now look at those people who once who were the reason that you have the morals you have now, right?
Yeah.
Like the reason I choose kindness, the reason I choose humanity, the reason I decide to listen instead of speak up is because of the values that I was taught. And I've had to get rid of a lot of values that I was taught too, but those core tenets of my personality or of my character were from the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And I think it feels almost like a betrayal to now witness so much hate and intolerance and just honestly straight up meanness towards gay people, trans people,
women,
feminists, women,
people of color,
immigrants,
and I think that's the hardest part. Is it's so hard not to be angry at the people who were the ones that taught you to be kind.
Yeah. Which I think, Tim, you hit on something similar to this in the sense of you as you broke things down, you were always trying to hold on to those values you were raised with. You're like, Trump doesn't align with these values that you've told me about. All these other people, they're not aligning. Loving your neighbor is wearing a mask, and why are we so upset about it? And so I'm curious just to hear a little bit from you about what compels you to stick with Christianity then, with all of this in mind. Why not just burn it all? Why not just say, never mind, we don't actually think this is redeemable. The Bible is inherently patriarchal. The Bible is inherently homophobic, which it's not. But if you were to say that it is, what keeps you?
Listen, let me just say, if there are people listening who were Christian and would say that they're no longer a Christian, I get it. That's totally your right to do. And I completely wish you the best on that journey. And it's legit. People walk out of the house of Christian thought all the time. They're allowed to do that. The reason why I have not and don't plan to is because the Christian faith is so much freaking bigger than the fundamentalist version of the faith I inherited. And so I think about it I was born in the basement of Christianity. I was born in the basement I call evangelical fundamentalism. And these gatekeepers convinced me that if I went up those stairs, there's nothing but a desert wasteland out there. I'm going to die. And so eventually I had the courage to walk out of the basement, and I went, holy shit, I'm in a huge house. There's so much here. I didn't know this stuff existed that is totally Christian, that might even be older than that basement I was a part of, that makes a lot more sense out of the world, that's way more flexible. And also there's a lot of disagreement. Okay. They don't all agree on things, but they're all still part of that Christian tradition. So for me, I feel like I never really gave Christianity a fair shake beyond what I knew, which would be fundamentalism. And so I don't feel like, I need to leave the house. There's plenty of room here. We have Black liberation theology, there's queer theology, womanist theology, there's the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's the Catholic tradition, there's other Protestant traditions, so there's plenty of things to explore and look at and listen and people to listen to before I decide to walk out of the house. So that being said, what that also means is that, I am pretty much done with evangelicalism in the traditional sense as we understand it here in America. I don't think there is a whole lot necessarily worth saving. I don't believe that the Bible is inerrant anymore. I just don't. They would say that makes me not a Christian. I would say, nope, that just makes me not a fundamentalist. And they have conflated the two. So I don't really give. I mean, when evangelical gatekeepers say, "Oh, progressive Christianity isn't real Christianity" or whatever, I'm like, okay, you're more than welcome to think that. You are more than welcome to think whatever you want. Luckily for me and you have absolutely no authority on my life or on my faith. So you can keep, screaming into your megaphone while your evangelical institutions consistently show how problematic they are, how they protect abusers, how they're Christian nationalists, and you can keep thinking that the real problem is everything beyond your basement. That's fine. But I'm out. I'm out of your basement. I don't care about your basement. although I will call for accountability. So that's kind of how I see it for me. It's like, that's why I'm still a Christian. I think that the way of Jesus is a beautiful way of living. It is subversive. It is countercultural in the best sense, not in the fundamentalist sense. And it ultimately wants to subvert empire, not become the empire. So I'm all about it.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I was talking to a friend who's very evangelical still, who about another person we knew who's a Coptic Christian, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's like Egyptian Orthodox Christianity, essentially, that was cultivated in Egypt and is much more in line with like the Eastern Orthodox rule of thought. And that friend's response to me saying that person who's a Coptic Christian was a Christian was, oh, well, they're not a real Christian. And it's like, oh, but they actually talk about their faith all the time. And they actually like are very passionate about their church community and they believe very deeply in the teachings of Jesus, but they might do it in a way that feels weird to you because you're used to, more non-denominational American evangelicalism that's very wary of something that they would probably call like an idol, which is like all of the saints that are recognized within like Orthodox or Catholic traditions, or these different like icons and miracles that they believe happened. And it's so weirdly exclusive. Like, why do you want to... what's the desire to minimize the amount of people that get to be part of the family of God? Like,
yeah.
Oh, totally. Also, Coptic Christianity is older than Protestant.
Yes, it is.
Like that. Whenever someone's like, Catholics aren't real Christians, I'm like, think about what you're saying. What you're saying is that billions of people who came before this movement are in hell right now. Are you kidding me? Like, what an audacious, prideful, arrogant claim to make. And so, I totally agree. Like American evangelicalism, broadly speaking, it wants to be as narrow as possible. And ultimately what they're saying is that up until us, pretty much no one got it right besides Paul and Barnabas. So, if you're outside of those traditions, you're fucked. It's like, okay, like you're more than welcome to play God in that sense, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
It definitely is. And it's, just like you said, it's so weirdly arrogant and narcissistic, which I think in the US and like Western culture, we are very individualistic in general. Like we tend to think the whole world revolves around us and what we're doing and forget that there's actually millions of other people, millions of other traditions, millions of other cultures that are very relevant and that have an impact on the world, that have an impact on the way that people may practice faith. And so I think it all stems into that as well, that we are in a very independent, individualistic society, along with a very individualistic form of Christianity where it's all about you. It's all about inward things, when like if you look at Christian tradition, it was so much about the outward, what you do for others, how you love others, how you care for others, how you serve others. And not to say that your own personal development or growth wasn't part of it, but I mean, you see essentially a communist structure in Acts with the early church and like that kind of thing, which, not to go down a whole rabbit trail of communism, but
just another plug for communism. Being podcast.
But I mean, it's a very socialist structure when it comes to the way that they built the early church and things like that. Like it was meant to serve others and meant to be a help for the communal good of all, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, and I think about how much time was spent in my life focusing on my relationship with God and our connection and what that meant and how little time in church at home was spent doing the good works or volunteering or...
I remember even being told things to the tune of, oh, it doesn't matter. Like I was a missionary for a year and I did multiple mission trips before that. And I was told by multiple like faith leaders, if you feel like you're not doing anything when you're on the mission field, it doesn't matter because really it's for you.
Like God is doing a work in you.
Yeah. Like, why is this for me? Yeah. Why did I need to go? Right. Like, sure, there are things that I gained from being a missionary, but that's not what they say the purpose of mission work is. Yeah. At least like when you're fundraising, you don't say it so that I can find myself. You say that it's to help these, poor children in other countries that we think we need to help or whatever. And so it's this twisted, like very self-centered mindset.
I mean, all of it, there's so many layers to that piece of it in terms of exploring other parts of Christianity. And I think that for me has been one of the interesting things in having deconstructed and looking back on my faith. I still have a hard time listening to other Christians and believing that they're Christians when they don't represent that fundamentalist background that I came from. Like, to me, it's like, okay, that's like a faith practice, I guess. Like, to me, it like still doesn't click as Christianity. And so I have a really hard time identifying with that term. But also, I think it's really beautiful to hear other Christians talk about their experience in different types of faith practice outside of evangelicalism. So it's a learning process. It's an unraveling of fundamentalism, I think, is even harder than an unraveling of the Christian faith itself, which leads me to ask, like, for you, what has been some of the hardest things to deconstruct and unravel as you've gone on this journey?
Well, I definitely think that it gets way easier once you're kind of over that initial hump of like that whole jumping off the cliff, and you kind of get used to the sense of free falling. Yeah. I think one of the hardest ones for me was definitely hell. You know, the idea of burning in hell forever was like really entrenched in my worldview. And I grew up Calvinist, which pretty much says that God has predestined who's going there and who's not. Before the foundations of the world, meaning before the world ever was even created. God already set the stage for who's in and who's out. So I think that hell was a big one for me to kind of not be so scared about being wrong on. You know, I think the reason why hell, especially the idea of burning in hell forever, is so powerful because it's like, well, what if you're
very
wrong?
High stakes.
Like, if you're wrong, you're going to roast forever in hell. Those are some pretty big stakes. I mean, it plays in the human psyche. I don't know anyone who wants to be eternally set on fire and burning forever.
Yeah, they don't serve breakfast there either.
So true. That's a nice nod right there. Oh, yeah, Captain Crunch is waving farewell. You know, and so I think that I think if someone's out there and they're panicking, like having that crisis of theology, that's what I call it. It's not so much a crisis of faith, where they're like, what do I believe? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm going to burn forever? Like, keep going. And you have to kind of like push through the fear and listen to other voices. And you're going to realize that like many, many faithful Christians, including early church fathers, did not hold to this view of eternal conscious torment. And so it's widely debated. And if it's widely debated, and God has set it up so you are going to burn in hell forever, you're in good company, I guess, because a lot of Christians who are way smarter than me have landed in very different positions on this topic. So I think for me, that's one of the big ones. I think the other one too is just like, what do I do with the Bible? Like, what do I do with it now? I mean, I was taught it was, God's inerrant word. God said it, that settles it. Just read the text plainly and you're good to roll. And then you listen to a Bible Project podcast, like one episode, and you're like, holy shit, this stuff is so much more complicated. Is. And then you kind of go from not one extreme to the other, but you kind of go from like this extreme of, okay, the Bible is like the blueprint for life, right? All I have to do is read this book and follow it. And then in chapter 4, Lamech takes 2 wives, and you're like, oh, well, that's a problem. You're right. Yeah, that's what I want. I just want more wives in my life.
Well, the Bible's backing you up.
Because one's definitely not enough. And so you kind of have that. And then you think, well, is there anything redeemable at all about the Bible? Like, is anything inspired? Is anything divine? Is there anything sacred in this text? And so I think it can be hard to renegotiate your relationship to the Bible, especially when you've been taught that's where you get your source of like objective truth or objective morality. And then you're reading and you're like, actually, mass genocide, because God told people to, maybe isn't the best sense of morality that I should be learning from, right? So I think those are two things that for people, including myself, have been kind of hard to renegotiate.
Can I ask on that, what type of Bible do you read then? Do you read the canonized Bible? Do you study other texts that have been discovered, some more recently, some more ancient?
Oh, study. Oh, I'm honored you think I would study the text like that. I am someone who has, quote, some college under my belt, okay? I'm not an academic. I do not read the Bible a whole lot. I listen to other people explaining the Bible a whole lot. So I am someone who has no problem saying I appeal to authority on this. So I'll listen to various people who are really, gifted in understanding the text and kind of listen to the different perspectives and how they come away with interpreting it, more than like me reading the Bible and be like, oh, look, guys, I'm studying the scripture by reading this thing in English, knowing I'm missing context and nuance and probably interpretations. But I read it, so therefore check it off my list. So I'm much more in the camp of like, oh, like what's Angela Parker's perspective on this? Or what does James Cone have to say about this? Like through the lens of Black liberation theology or Pete Enns. That's kind of more of my speed.
Well, that's so cool. Controversial to even hear you say, well, honestly, I don't. Like, people from the evangelical background that we come from. Like,
you should be reading your Bible every day.
Like, it's our job to keep you accountable and make sure that you start doing that more often, Like, that's like the gut reaction.
Yeah,
definitely.
From that background.
You have your reading plan and you read the whole Bible in a year and then you do it again the next year and again and again. And if you can't repeat it yet, you just got to keep going.
Like, are you even good with God?
Yeah. Have you had your quiet time?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely, it's this weird, 100%. Which I don't even understand why that exists in American evangelicalism the way that it does. Like, why is there this insistence on meditating on the Bible in that way, rather than meditating the Bible from maybe a more scholarly viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go way back, it comes from the Protestant Reformation. Like, we're all Protestant, and sola scriptura is kind of the rallying cry. The idea of like every Christian should be able to have a copy or at least read the Bible on their own terms. Very different than the Catholic position, which is the Pope and the Church interpret Scripture for the masses. So I think you have that ingredient, and I think you have like this fundamentalist movement that happened like the early 20th century that pretty much was like, hey, like we have to just read the Bible and that is everything. And that what that comes from is it really actually comes from modern categories. So like fundamentalists realize that, okay, the Bible's coming under scrutiny in a different way for the first time. It's being scrutinized under like a modernist lens. So a critical scholarship, people who are thinking, well, is the Bible actually giving recording footage of historical events or not? How, in light of all these manuscripts that we have, there's discrepancies. What do we do with that? So the Bible was being approached very differently, and holes were starting to get poked. Right? Like, hey, like this stuff doesn't add up the way that we thought it did, or actually the archaeological evidence of this thing doesn't support what this narrative in the Bible says about whatever it would be. And so a lot of like the fundamentalists, I'm paraphrasing a lot, but essentially they go, well, like we have to cling to the truth of God's word in the objective sense. Like, no, the Bible is objective truth. It's reality because God has like coined this thing. So that's why you have this like dichotomy in evangelical spaces of science versus religion, as opposed to science and religion. Like you need both. They answer very different questions. I think like science can give you the how, religion can give you the why, ultimately. And so it's really a handshake. But in evangelical circles, like we're kind of taught that like, no, the Bible is what gives you the true story of the creation account. 6 literal days. It's like, actually, that's just really bad exegesis. Like that's really bad, out of context, out of its historical framework, exegesis that gets you in all sorts of trouble. So I think that's kind of how we got there, and it's a very hard thing to break because it's ingrained into people, including myself, at a very young age.
Not to mention that Genesis has 2 separate creation stories at the very beginning. First thing you see is 2 different creation stories lined out. So how can you take both of them literally? That doesn't make sense, and it takes an understanding of how Hebrew literature works, and taking everything, I think, much more humbly and recognizing we don't actually like. In some senses, we can't understand certain things because we weren't there. We're not part of that culture. We are, humble Gentiles coming into this, or whatever you want to call us. And so I think that is something that I've found as well. Like as I've deconstruction did certain things, and I was like such a faithful daily Bible reader for so long. And now like I find so much richness and depth and faith through learning from other people, like you're talking about. Like my church community does like read the Bible together, but it's so much more of questioning the Bible together and discussing the Bible together and pondering, what do we think that this could mean, or what have we heard that this means from other scholars, or how do we see this get abused? We talk about that a lot, and I think that's become a super valuable way for me to navigate the text, even though it's not something that it like quote unquote quiet time doesn't look how it used to look. That's just not practical for the way that I think faith operates now.
Well, I remember being like, so many things were drilled into my head in my little bit of graduate theology experience, which is this concept of belief, and like, this is the truth, and your belief must align with it. I remember being in this theology class, and they were breaking down all the reasons that all these different examples used to try and illustrate the Holy Spirit are heresy. And they just like went down the list of like, no, it's not the water, ice, and gas. And no, you can't say this because that's heresy too.
Yeah,
and
the egg, the shell, the yolk, and the egg white.
Yeah, they all have different names for why they're heresy and all that stuff. And this concept of belief and it being correct is so fragile in the sense that the average American Christian, or even like the average Christian in the world, probably could not and would not verbally be able to communicate the Holy Trinity in that perfect sequence of words that we were learning in this theology class. That if that is so critical to understanding God and thus the true Jesus.
Lest you commit heresy and go to hell.
Well, yeah, and like they considered it so crucial to our understanding of God and thus the true God that it's like, if you believe about the Trinity wrong, then suddenly you're, which by the way is a very vague, barely defined concept created by Christians that is not clearly stated in the Bible at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Just the idea that could determine your fate, it kind of opens up the world to, okay, like maybe it's not necessarily about belief here, like in terms of I believe that the one and only God, Father, Holy Spirit, Son, and the Son came down to earth and died for our sins. That, you know, like maybe that's not what it's about. I mean, it's impossible that would be what it's about. Like, it's statistically impossible that anyone would make it into the gates.
Yeah. It's interesting because even like what you were talking about is the concept of truth. That itself, the idea of absolute truth, is a very new concept. It's a very recent principle in our history as humans. I've been listening to a podcast called Know Thyself, which is very ooey wooey, and it's very focused on more occultism and esoteric principles. But they have a whole episode where they break down the concept of truth and historically what that looks like. And it's like, guys, this is new on the scene of humanity, and the idea of like, there's one truth and you must know it and we must spread it to everyone. Like, actually, I don't know if I'm going to go ahead and say it. I don't think that really existed in biblical times. Granted, I'm still new and learning, but like it doesn't seem like that is, it's like, go share good news. Like good news that someone loves you, someone died for your sins, versus like there's an absolute truth to know and evangelize through.
I mean, I'm certainly not the expert to be asking this question, but I'm under the impression that the concept of truth is probably better translated like trustworthy in a lot of cases versus what we think of like something being, like you said, objectively so. Which again, it's like, that's just enlightenment thinking, not necessarily a bad thing. The scientific method helps us understand like, you know, okay, the earth is objectively round, not flat. But those aren't the categories that like you would map onto religion. It doesn't make any sense. And I don't think that, like you said, I don't think Jesus was making these absolute truth claims. I think he was making claims of him being trustworthy or him being the path, to ultimate reconciliation, the kingdom, whatever you want to say. That's very different than like him making a claim that I am objectively true in like the metaphysical, Platonic sense, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I ask I have like a quick selfish question for you, which is something I've been pondering, and I'm just curious what you've come to think about this, if you even have something specific that you are thinking about this now in your deconstruction as you've looked into these different rooms of Christianity, is how do you encounter like the doctrine of like miracles? And how do you
Good question.
How do you reconcile, like, I don't know if you've like, I know that you were not necessarily part of charismatic churches, but you're in charismatic spaces, and especially with your music. And so I'm sure that you've seen at least some extent of like miracle theology. How do you reconcile that now? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, as I would affirm a physical resurrection and a virgin birth, which are both, obviously miracles, so to speak. But I also understand how, again, like we can't objectively prove that they happened. I'm not going to be like, how dare you not believe that? I do think that it seems like we've created this world of the Bible because of how it talks of an enchanted magical world back then. And somehow now in reality, like something magically shifted one day from like, wow, talking snakes to no more talking snakes. I think a lot of those things are metaphorical for sure. Now, like John Dominic Crossan, who's like a New Testament scholar, his big thing is like, hey, metaphor creates realities. So when we speak in metaphor, which we do even today as humans, just because we're not saying something literally happened doesn't make it like less real, because the metaphor speaks into a reality that happened, or we're creating a reality. I mean, one example is if you think that you have a wolf in sheep's clothing in your church, no one thinks you have a literal wolf disguised as a sheep. What you're saying is that someone in our community is not safe. And the reality of that metaphor is that person usually gets kicked out. Right. So metaphor creates reality. So that has helped me kind of think about like, okay, when we're reading like these biblical authors, what exactly are we talking about here? So I don't have like the best answer. But when it comes to like today and like the charismatic gifts, I largely do not take them as miracles. I've been in plenty of those worship services where there's a highly charged emotional moment. Thanks to me on
well
the drums,
done.
Good job.
building up the moment. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm really good at doing that. Like really good. And someone's like, "Oh, I've been healed," or like my ankle was broken, now it's healed. I mean, I think it's been proven that like most of those claims are usually bogus. At the same time, there are people who have had experiences that like even scientists would say, yeah, don't know what happened. Something happened. Don't know how it works. We can classify this as beyond our understanding of like the physical world. So I'm not someone who's like, oh, God can never in a supernatural way work. I just tend to be extremely skeptical of these, like, I just regrew my toes, those kinds of claims.
Yeah. My leg was shorter than the other and it grew out.
God.
And it's
that one seems really common.
That one's super common.
It's weird, honestly.
I'm like, you know what you can also do is go get a chiropractic adjustment for that. It's an option.
Also, your body can shift so that your legs seem different lengths.
Yes.
Yeah. I've been contemplating that a lot lately. My church community recently talked about like, why did miracles happen for some people and not for others? Like that big question that I feel like we ask. And I've had experiences that I would call miraculous. And I look at them and I'm like, okay, how do I reconcile this? Because it feels like it wasn't a coincidence in the way that things happened. And actually, to bring up Tim Mackey again, he recently talked about a miracle that he felt happened to him on an episode of the Bible Project, which I was surprised to hear because he doesn't typically talk about that kind of personal thing, but he talks about this spine problem he had as a child, and he was prayed over and healed way quicker than doctors thought that he would. And it's like, okay, how do we navigate that now? And how does that impact the way we think about God when God is not this like same sort of like dominating all powerful deity the way that maybe I would have formally thought of God to be. And I don't think that God is cruel in like wanting to pick and choose certain people to get miracles and others to not. But I also like, it's exciting to me to think about something miraculous happening, and it feels like, oh, this is some sort of, I want it to link to like a divine movement in the world. I want it to link to, there is this ultimate source of good that is impacting people, but then that doesn't explain why the person who has so much faith in God and prays for their child, for their pregnancy to go through and they have a miscarriage, like that doesn't explain that. It doesn't help that, which I'm contemplating all of that right now, which is a whole rabbit trail to go down. But it's interesting just to hear how other people who are in that more progressive Christian space are navigating that, and like, how do we wrestle with that question? And to me, the answer of just like, this is just a mystery of God, like that doesn't feel very satisfactory to me. So
I hear you, but I don't have any other answer at this moment.
Totally.
It's a complicated one for sure. But speaking of complicated and all the things that the new evangelicals may or may not be up to, where do you see the new evangelicals going? Like, what dreams do you have? Do you have any goals? What's the business plan? Not
Give us your 5-year plan.
Those are secrets. Secrets for you and your board.
Oh, yeah. We have so many secrets. So.
You started this, you had this idea, and it's just taken off. Like, where do you see it going?
I mean, I don't really know. We actually just had a board meeting tonight with someone to kind of start helping us walk through like strategic planning, because I have a lot of ideas, but like how we organize them is different. I think that like, man, it's so tough. Like I love what I get to do. I love making content, but I think like the next step as an organization is like, how do we get people connected to each other? So they know that like they're not alone. Like we have some of those things already. Like you can go to our website, make a free account, get access to our private Facebook community. We have a map on there where you can see who's in your area and like message people. But like a lot of folks don't know that, or it's like not like in like their habit of, it's not like in like their default things to do on their phone is to go to our website and go to the map. So I think we're trying to think about ways to kind of build that, because people message me all the time. Hey, I want to get connected. I want to find people in my area. I'm so lonely. So we have the network. Now it's a matter of kind of getting them connected to each other. So I think that's definitely something that we're kind of thinking about. Of course, we're always trying to fundraise because we're a nonprofit to make all this stuff possible. But I think ultimately, I just hope that two things I hope for. One, that we're able to push the evangelical church forward, and that people are aware that like, hey, like there's other ways of thinking about these things. And I think B, that people who are part of our community who like engage with us actually have a place to go that connects them to other people who are in their area, so they can make some new friends, like actual in-person real life friends.
That's really good. And I think you've done such a good job at building that network. People know like your page is a safe space, but like getting connected to those others that are like-minded, like you said. I'm curious also, if I can add an extra question, what is something that surprised you the most about all this? Like, has there been a leader that you've called out that is like DM'd you and been like, hey, you're right, I was super messed up? Or,
oh my gosh, if that has ever happened, I will shit my pants.
Like, right here. Like, what's been surprising and shocking?
Andy Stanley DM'd me, and I flew out to meet him for a weekend. That was pretty shocking because of our work. So that blew me away. I'm shocked that I'm doing this work full time. Like, I'm shocked that people donate. I'm shocked that people resonate. I'm shocked that some of our videos have over 1 million views. Like, that's freaking crazy. I'm shocked that I talk to people like Pete Enns, like via text message. That shocks me. So I think a lot of that stuff shocks me, frankly. Like, what am I doing here? Why is this person reaching out to me? It's just, I've been in some places that I'm like, why am I here? Like, what am I doing here? So I think there's a lot of those things have definitely surprised me for sure. I mean, even having someone who has a foot in the world of like Turning Point USA, flying me out to America Fest to experience the whole thing. That was shocking. You know, like, wow, you want me to go to a Christian nationalist event? And I met many people who I call out online in person, and we got along great. We shook hands and had some good faith dialogue. So that was shocking. Like, what am I doing here? But also, I'm glad I'm here. So I think those are a few things that definitely have shocked me.
Tim, we're coming to a close, and we have a question for you that we ask every single guest that we have on the podcast. This is a question that is always interesting to hear when we have male guests, because it's a more, I don't know, maybe something that male guests aren't thinking about as much, or it's just fascinating to hear their interpretation of it. But the question is open to interpretation, and it is, what does the phrase woman being mean to you?
I thought it was like a hear me roar kind of thing. Like, women are here and we're being, so deal with it. It's like, sweet, I'm in.
That's amazing. I think that's the first time we've heard that.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Look
it
at
is,
that.
I am woman, hear me roar.
Women
are being here. Period. You can't stop us.
Yeah.
Put it on a t-shirt. We can make $1 million.
We'll make $1 million.
Yeah. We'll add that to our merch line.
That doesn't exist. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Great. So Tim, I would love to hear if you have any resources that you would recommend to listeners. Could be books, could be podcasts, could be movies, just people that they should be consuming content from when it comes to deconstruction, faith, when it comes to being, navigating the world as a Theo bro, when it comes to whatever, how to do the 10-step journey to being a deconstruction wizard, whatever you want to plug in terms of resources for our listeners, I would love to hear.
So I would say the easiest way, honestly, just go to our Instagram. We have an entire resource highlight. There's like 45 slides on that resource highlight. Books, podcasts, YouTube videos. That's the easiest place to start for us, because it's so wide. Everything from hell to the Bible to, you name it. So I would start there. If you're looking for a couple of good podcasts, about the Bible, obviously Bible Project is great. Bible for Normal People is really good too. And I'm trying to think Pete Enns' new book, Curveball, that I just read is really great for people who might be kind of trying to think about better paths forward. And then if you're looking for a book on Christian nationalism, Preparing for War by Bradley Onishi is really good too.
Amazing.
Nice.
We will add those to our reading list.
I have an extra question. If someone is wanting to get involved in the New Evangelicals, or if you're hiring, you mentioned you're shot a pilot, there's a lot happening. Like, where do they find that information?
So I'm going to be transparent with everyone here, okay? And this is just the reality. We have like 20 volunteers, so we're pretty stacked on volunteers. If someone really wants to get involved with our work, the easiest way that helps us is a small donation. Like, that's the honest truth. I mean, finances as a nonprofit is always kind of like on my mind, because we're not a business, because we didn't want to exploit people who were going through a faith crisis for a financial gain. So we said, let's just offer everything for free. Let's offer no Patreon, no paywalls. Everything is totally accessible, and we'll just fundraise. So honestly, donating is the most direct, easiest way to get involved with us. It helps hold space for thousands of people. It's a tax-deductible donation, and it's the most direct way.
That's good. I love it.
Good to know.
Plug for New Evangelicals. If
Go donate.
Perhaps leaving the church and looking for a new place to plant your generosity dollars.
Yeah.
That might be a spot for you, if it feels right.
We do not guarantee that God will bless you. We do not guarantee a new car in your driveway. No surprise check
no
in the
crumbs
mail.
in heaven.
You're not giving to God.
You don't get you don't give out personalized prophetic words, Tim. What is?
No. Just a personalized thank you. But I will say too, for your audience, because I know so many of us are giving traumatized, we are completely financially transparent. You can go to our website right now and see your last quarter's profit and loss statement. It's all right there. Like, we don't hide anything. So all of your donations are easily tracked online. You can see where the money goes. There's no secrets here. I'm not driving around in a Mercedes or, on preachers and sneakers wearing like expensive shoes.
But what about your private
That's
jet?
just not where the money's going. Well, I didn't mention that for a reason.
What about your wizard staff, Tim?
Yeah.
To end racism, right?
Yeah.
Like
I know.
They like stamp the ground. Yeah. Good time.
Anyways, all that to say, Tim, this has been such a great conversation. We're so thrilled to have been able to just like pick your brain a little bit. You're someone that we've watched for a long time, and it's great to get that peek behind the door of the New Evangelicals and to also just hear about what it's like, more about what it's like navigating deconstruction, navigating breaking down the Christian faith, navigating all that comes with being a Christian in the United States today. And so we really appreciate you taking the time and being so generous with your time. Woman Beings, you should go follow the New Evangelicals on Instagram, on TikTok, follow the podcast, do all the things, make a profile on their website.
Find other new evangelicals.
I have
like
a profile, so there's like 7 other people in our area that do.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much for taking the time. Woman Beings, we hope that you'll also follow us if you aren't already. We're on Instagram, we're on TikTok, we're on all the podcast platforms. Give us a 5-star review and then give New Evangelicals a 5-star review. And that will help more people find our content. And now we're going to wrap it the heck up. Thank you again, Tim. Thank you, Woman Beings. Thank you, Kelly and Kellyanne.
You're so welcome.
We'll catch you next time.
Bye.